thank you all very much for a very insightful set of speeches, and Sam, sobering if not depressing. So what I'll do, trust me, I will be a democratic moderator, but I'd like to give the authors a chance to respond to some of these questions around consciousness raising and building infrastructures of dissent that Sam Gindin has raised, and perhaps even address some of the points that Pam has raised as well. Does that sound okay? Maybe we'll spend a couple of minutes on that, yeah? And then we'll move to the audience. Yes, everybody's on board? Great, okay.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Pam. In the same way, no, thank you. But they're both actually thought-provoking sets of comments. I like your comment about near the end about the working, like the sort of the entirety of the working class. And I think there's lots of hard questions there too about planning. Like when you mentioned, I think you mentioned specifically care workers, there was something that made me think about sort of all the sort of social and care work or the unpaid work that really happens. And I think the way to, I think that question often, even when I'm sort of thinking about it and talking about it, though, like thinking about economic planning as something that's already, that only takes the formal economy as sort of what is the economic sphere. I think that's a danger, and I think there's some really hard questions to think through in terms of the informal economy, the home economy, and how that gets incorporated into, again, it doesn't have to be into planning, into how we think about economic alternatives from the left, and then again that big question of who gets a say and who are the people and how that work is distributed. I think all the difficult questions are genuine difficult questions. One thing I would say, I think Sam is entirely right that we'll need sort of an external measure. Like even when you talked about the aluminum versus the steel or any question like that, we need some. Or we don't need, there is always some kind of external measure when we're talking about sort of social production and then individuals making somehow decisions over it. I think we have to recognize that in some sense, prices are also an external measure, but that is somehow able to comprehend kind of social information. And we need something that's able to do those things that might not generate the same efficiencies under the sort of logic that we have now, but that will be able to fulfill that same function of an external criterion that can both compare things that are qualitatively different. And I do think, when we had some responses from libertarians, and they also said, well, Walmart uses prices, and it uses prices as a reference point both internally and then externally. And I think they're right. I think what some of the things that Leigh said point to is that there is more and more use of non-price information now, again with external reference points, but that you can start to tease apart that sort of qualitatively different information that gets compressed into a price into the actual things that you want to be talking about. So sort of directly comparing some of the real resources. Doing like carbon budgeting starts to do some of that, or some ways that we started thinking about climate change, where you're thinking about what are the actual, not just the price of this in terms of even, and the capitalist side will say, well, let's just ask people and then have them price what living in a shitty, like polluted city is, and then if they think it's worth $500, well then we'll just give them $500 and a polluted shitty city. But actually thinking about what those costs are on in terms of real resources and how they're impacting things. But it is a bit, it's still I think it's another way where it's the poverty of imagination of thinking that the only way we can compare real resources to one another is through this one particular external measure, which is very good at what it at what it does, but I think that's the hard question. Like, what is, and that gets at sort of democracy, and that gets at levels of democracy. Because who's going to be the person who goes and says no, you should use whatever, steel or aluminum, or bigger questions than that. But that's a big question in terms of climate or whatever. And on what basis, and in what situations, and what's that socially determined external measure that isn't a price? I know that's a little abstract, but it raises that big question for me, at least, and I think it is a hard question, but I also don't think it's insoluble. But that goes back to the question of process and all of that. I thought the other questions were also very difficult.
First thing I wanted to say was it is really quite stunning for me to be sitting on the same stage as Sam Gindin, just a outer hero of mine, along with his co-writer Leigh Phillips, and for the two of us to be working together. And now, like on the same stage as you, it's really quite humbling. So, thank you so incredibly much for the very kind words that you said. The making of global capitalism is absolutely an essential work. Please, everybody, pick that up. Now.
Much harder to read.
No, it's a lovely read as well. Well, no, I think whatever. I do think it's interesting here. I'm going to jump to this issue of the aluminum use and basically the problem of multi-dimensional comparison, and how that might be determined socially, because that actually is all of the other challenges, all of the other discussions are actually way lower in terms of importance, in terms of the feasibility. Everything else is this is the thing. So I'll respond to that in a second. But I will concede that it is hard. It's not an easy question. But the first thing that I wanted to say was it was this really interesting thing so Pam, first out of the gates, cheered us on for finally being optimistic, for saying this is feasible. Like, we don't have to just like rage against stuff, and we should be raging against all sorts of horrible things. But that there's a way, there's a path for it. That there's there's a way to do this. And then Sam, as Sam said, there's a great worry, and I would agree with him here, that you could read this and say, oh, it's really easy, all we have to do is nationalize Walmart, and then tickety-boo, we've got socialism and everything's going to be wonderful. And actually, we have a chapter called Nationalization is Not Enough. We talk so extensively about how not merely is that not enough moving forward, but where that has happened in the past, that hasn't been enough. There is a real reason why the arguments of Thatcher and Reagan in the 1980s fell on fertile soil amongst many working class folks when they said that when the government comes to fix a problem, it's the worst. What was Reagan's famous line about this? The worst possible message ever is the government saying,
I'm here from the government, I'm here to help.
The experience of many people of this paternalism, of the term the nanny state, is not just a right-wing term. This is a real phenomenon. So I think we do take that very seriously. But also that it's not about it being easy. In my day job as a science writer, I write a lot about climate change and a number of other issues as well. But with climate change, as a science writer, I'm always kind of frustrated with two sort of narratives. One is this Pollyanna-ish vision of, well, here's the technologies and here's how we're going to solve it, without any sort of need to really change the relations of production, never really changing anything. And the other side of things, the Cassandras, that we have 10 years to save the planet, otherwise everybody's going to be dead. Like, no, that's not what the science says either. And it's a sort of and the perspective that a number of my colleagues talk about is this sober sense of urgency, rather than either being Cassandras or Pollyannas. And I think that's the same thing that we try to do with this, is we're not saying this is easy, but we're also not saying that there are discussions on the left sometimes that it's all going to be completely different. Everything's going to be awesome. It's going to be puppies and ice cream. There's not going to be any drudgery or alienation or anything at all. It's like, no, I mean, there is still going to be drudgery. It's just going to be shared equally.
That's a winner.
And hopefully, thanks to technological advance, we will steadily reduce the amount of drudgery over time. But I mean, so it's. I think we're very careful to try to not be either like it's going to be easy, but at the same time, like saying, well, some of it really is just lying around for us to. Some of these tools are waiting for us to be for us to pick them up. Going to throw it back to you guys in a sec, so I'm not going to take it. But this question of aluminum use, I did want to get to this. Sorry. So, just as our book was coming out, there was another book that came out by an Austrian sort of big data or data science researcher and internet governance scholar, Victor Meyer-Schoenberger. And when I say Austrian, I just mean he's Austrian. I don't mean he's an Austrian economist. But he does come from that side of that side of things. The book is called Reinventing Capitalism in the Age of Big Data. And he argues very much from a pro-capitalist perspective, from a point of view, that the price signal is today diminishing in importance with respect to a raft of transactions already. He argues that while price is a compression of information, and historically that's been incredibly useful compared to the army of bureaucrats, or the proposed army of bureaucrats, it's not a lossless compression. And he says that a restoration of those losses is being permitted by multidimensional comparison that the human brain finds difficult to assess. And one of the examples he gives is buying plane tickets, where recommendation engines use price as only one amongst an increasing multiplicity of factors that, again, humans just would have difficulty themselves being able to assess. So the argument is not that that as a result of this, technology is going to save us, but that these are interesting things that the other side is recognizing are happening. One can very well imagine here, like his vision is where price steadily diminishes importance over time, with the convergence of the owners and the planners, without there ever being any reckoning taking place between the ruling class and the rest of us. So, I mean, the other side does see that. So when I'm not saying that the capitalism style. No, God no, unfortunately. But that the neoliberal moment is having a bit of a crisis, and I think it has been having a bit of an ideological crisis since 2008.
Well, thank you. So we'll open it up to the floor. Okay, Steve is ready to go. Okay, so two things. I will move around the mic, but there are serious limitations with cord length here, so we'll make the best of it. Maybe we'll take 2 to 3 questions at a time.
Sure, I can take a stab. Well, why don't I take it, again, I think I'm probably going to be the odd person out in this conversation because I think I have quite a different take on things, and any book that talks about Allende blowing his brains out after failed socialist experiments, I didn't feel like was Pollyanna-ish in any way. So I think that the challenges about affecting change are laid out quite nicely, but I do think that there is a risk of presupposing that all of these details need to be worked out in advance before we can actually embark on a collective experiment. And it is true we have to understand some broad contours, but I'll just give the example of Greece, because in Greece, at the depth of the economic crisis that was imposed by the European Union, there was already an alternative economy thriving, which was the human need economy, because people had no freaking money. They had no fucking medicine to keep their loved ones alive. So guess what? They went out and traded whatever they had with other people who were desperate to have those things. And the amazing thing is that workers, when left to their own devices, can actually solve a few of these problems. But the challenge was, and I think that the academic left played a role in this, is that because people didn't feel like they had the the precise technological schema worked out about how exactly Greece was going to say no to the huge austerity measures being imposed by the European Union, even though the people of Greece gave a massive, massive mandate to Syriza to reject the terms being imposed by the European Union, Syriza didn't have the confidence to go with the people and actually advance that agenda. And why? Because they couldn't imagine an alternative outside the bounds of the state and socialism. And so that's why I was excited about the book, is because it actually poses those very contradictions. And I think that we have to be mindful that somehow there's going to be a caste of people who are going to have these things worked out, when I think the people in struggle if left to their own devices, are able to work these things out. And one thing to say that most of the problems when humanity is trying for an alternative experiment is not their trial and error and the mistakes they make. It's the massive pressure coming from other capitalist states to try to undermine that experiment. And so in many ways, the reason a global perspective is so important is so that we can stay the hands of our own nation state. And then just on the question, I wasn't saying that the algorithm is going to solve all of this. What I'm saying is that these are tools like any technology, any mechanism, science, all of these kinds of things. They are what they are based on whether or not they're democratically controlled by the people, or whether or not they're put at the use of capitalism. So technology is neither good nor bad. It depends on how much control they are having, the people are having around it. And one other thing that I think is really important is and I think it was laid out also in the book, and I encourage everyone to read the whole thing, is that actually when you have a revolution, it transforms people. Just as the way markets transform our consciousness and create markets that we probably, people buy things they probably never dreamt they needed because of the way capitalism impacts upon us. Same with the revolutionary period. When people experience mass struggle, when they experience the effects of changing their lives and caring for one another, when they, in other talks I've talked about, when they get their solidarity on, the things they think that were impossible yesterday suddenly become possible, and the desires that they had yesterday are suddenly no longer desires. So I actually think that initially, if left to their own devices, figuring out a few things is going to be very simple. It's going to be, how do we make sure that everyone gets the medicine they need? How are we going to make sure that everyone gets the food they need and the housing they need? And I frankly don't think those kinds of discussions are that complicated. But part of the problem is the working class is told constantly that they're not smart enough to figure it out, that we need a bunch of wise people to figure it out. And I think that in itself is a barrier to class struggle. And my own feeling is that when workers are left to their own devices, whether it's the Winnipeg general strike and they're trying to figure out how to get milk to working class families in the middle of a shutdown, a general strike, or whether it's the electricity workers in France who are shutting down power to the rich neighborhoods and turning it on for the poor neighborhoods, or whether it's the poll tax uprising in Britain where they were, reversing evictions and so forth. All of those things, people start to figure these things out for themselves. They just need the space to do it.
I just want to flag a couple of things, and then maybe get back to what Pam was saying. One of the things that needs to be talked about is, at one level, by any measurement, socialism is going to be, quote, less efficient because a lot of people are going to have to spend their time in participatory democracy. There's just going to have to be a lot of time off of work to do that. Democracy is going to have that implication. The second thing I just want to emphasize is, when economists talk about the limits of the market, they all concede that there's externalities. Otherwise the market looks good, so you have to fix those externalities. Well, what those externalities are is they include the environment and they include inequality, as Greg was saying. And those two issues have become especially important. That's part of the delegitimation of markets, because if you're talking about the environment and you're talking about inequality, you're talking about not marginal things, but two of the most important things. I want to say something about optimism and pessimism, and then just say something about what Pam was raising and maybe try to answer that question. I'll try to be very quickly. I don't think we should think in terms of whether we're optimists or pessimists. I don't think that's a useful self-labeling. What we're after is the truth. and a sense of believing in human potential. Like if we can't figure it out, then we have to go through a process of figuring it out. And I don't think we have to argue about whether that's being optimistic or pessimistic. We do have to think about this question of human potentials and what workers can spontaneously do. Workers generally are spontaneously creative. They find that there's a problem, they do things. In Greek, they did start supplying food, and they did start supplying medicines. But they didn't win. They needed something more than that. To solve the problem of food and medicine, they understood that you had to have some relationship to the state. This was a creative response given the limits, but it wasn't a solution. And we have to be conscious of that. And it's the same thing with revolutions. Revolutions do transform people. That doesn't mean that it transforms them permanently. When you have a revolution, the people who went through it change in certain fantastic ways, but maybe not. Maybe you don't have the same kind of skills you need to make a revolution that you need to run a society. Then the second generation didn't go through the revolution. Maybe it'll be different. And then in the new society, maybe a lot of the leaders who were in the revolution are now on the planning committee and playing a new institutional role. There's a great quote by Rozworski talking about, and he says in a really depressed way, that the worker that I see now in 1928, I mean the worker that I knew in 1917, I couldn't recognize in 1928, and it was a worker. He wasn't saying that the bureaucrats took over, or this is a revolutionary worker. So we just, again, it's just being conscious of that. And to the question that was raised, which it's a really good question about, what's going on now that we can say is contributing to us learning something today in terms of experiments. I think what we have to be careful about in those experiments is if workers are taking over a factory because it's closing, we should absolutely support it. But we shouldn't pretend this is a strategy for winning. Taking over what capital doesn't want isn't a strategy for winning. Taking over what they want to keep is a strategy for winning. And I want to say that generally, when we talk about co-ops on the margins of society, some people do this because they want an alternative lifestyle. And I'm not opposed to it, but we should recognize that a lot of those experiments are about letting capital keep doing what it wants and us trying to do other things on the margin, and it doesn't change society. So we just have to be conscious about that. And the third thing we have to be conscious about is, what are people really learning from what they're doing? So they could be learning to become businessmen in a collective way. And what we have to always think about is what kind of capacities are being developed. Some of those capacities are useful in terms of practical, how are you going to run things? But we also have to be thinking about what political capacities are being developed in these things. Why aren't co-ops using some of their money to hire organizers and to use their space for political education? And that would be a different way of thinking about co-ops, so that they're part of building the political capacities. And we're running out of time.
Just to the third question, very briefly, I think that's right, that we don't want to do the things that capital doesn't want to do, or we don't necessarily, that's not the real goal. I mean, I think in terms of the Preston model, I think there's some inspiration to take there from the fact that that's more an entire community that's been sort of left behind, and there are some things, I think, that was actually in Cleveland, but similar. Preston took a lot of its inspiration from Cleveland, and in Cleveland, one of the first things they did was start up an industrial laundry or something like that, where that is actually something that people need to do. It's just that this was a extremely economically depressed city, and you had to use sort of the public sector and the anchor institutions to get it running. So I mean, I think there's some examples there of things that we might want to take, but again, they're very dependent on, even if it's things that that aren't just the kind of the things that capital doesn't want to do because they're not profitable. They're still highly dependent on these sort of institutional contexts right now, that there's someone willing to front something in order to get it going. I agree on Greg's point about externalities. I mean, that was kind of my point with an external standard. Like even the externality itself, how you price pollution, like the damage of, say, pollution or the damage of climate change or whatever. Some of these economics is sometimes not the best like science. Like some of it literally is like going up. I mean, they have fancy models, but sometimes, yeah, like I said, like Sam said, random crowd. It literally involves like going and asking people how much you would have to pay them to like have cancer and have it untreated, and you're like, 10,000, sure, whatever, 10,000, and it's like, oh, and that's the externality. Okay, great, solved. But it's some way. Scientifically crappy, but still some way of trying to find that kind of external standard. But the whole point is that you're no longer sort of letting the price mechanism do its work kind of automatically, but you are, even if the end result is you just changing the price, you're doing it according to something else that isn't sort of a measure that's coming out automatically from the from sort of the systemic workings. On the participatory planning point, it's true we don't cite Devine or Wainwright, though we did read them for the book. Yeah, both Pat and Hillary's stuff. I mean, I think it's partly just the limits of how much you can say and how many people you can cite. Because I think, and it isn't to say that defensively, is to say I think I'm hoping that there is that aspect of participatory planning that does run through the book quite a bit, and that's the whole focus really on democratization, and not as a sort of throwaway line, but what kind of transformation that entails, and that's one ultimately rooted in the participation of ordinary people in decision making at lots of different levels, from that sort of firm level to higher levels. And there's lots and lots of hard questions about how and why, who has a say in what, and Sam's raised them and other people have raised them today. But I mean, I think my short answer is yes, we read them, yes, we hope that they come through, and we're sorry if they don't. Like genuinely, that's something that I think we both deeply would think would be central to any argument for planning. I'll let, I think, Leigh I think wants to say something about, or we both want to say something about Steve's question. I'll let Leigh, because he wrote
which one?
That the one on Sears.
Right. Yeah. Well,
because you wrote the section on Sears.
Do you want to?
Well, okay. I'll say
we know Eddie Lampert pretty well.
We know Eddie Lampert pretty well, so I can say sure. So there is. I think it's a good question. Again, I think we don't want to say that we don't want to fall into that same trap of calling the firm a black box. Funnily enough, in the chapter on Walmart, there's kind of like a coda, an ending to it that goes through the example of Sears as sort of the comically bad version of this transformation of the corporation under pressures of like private equity or whatever. The guy called Crazy Eddie Lampert took over Sears as a sort of private equity shark in the 80s, 90s?
Late 2000s.
Early 2000s. Introduced like a complete, it's a funny story because he was sort of a huge proponent of Ayn Rand, like a total committed Randian, and he took over Sears, and he was basically horrified at the fact that there's all this planning going on. I mean, figuratively, but he really was. He was like, holy shit, there's like way too much like intervention and not enough markets here.
Shit, Sears is communist.
Yeah, right? Basically. Yeah, exactly. Like there should be a market everywhere for everything. So he turned Sears into a total internal market. Departments competing against each other. Multiple marketing departments competing against marketing departments in like other clothing section has a market. This has a marketing department. Tons of duplication. Tons of competition. We know how it ends. It ends in total bankruptcy. I mean, Eddie's still laughing all the way to the bank, but the workers are out, and so are the pensioners. So it's like everything, a tragic comedy. Ultimately, in the end, and that's like the comical version of this process of financialization and transformation. But it's true. it's true that those things happen throughout lots of different firms. We talk about within Amazon, there are these intense pressures, not just in terms of like the marketplaces that it creates, even on its own site, but just the competition between teams that it engenders within the corporation. But even these are all sort of like, they're sort of planned experiments, and they do bleed into the public sector, and they still happen within a firm that plans towards certain goals and is a sphere of collective activity, even if it uses currently more competition to kind of regulate internally some of the ways it's heading towards its goals. I don't know if I can't really see, so I can't see if Steve's like totally frowning. Oh, okay, because I thought that was, and specifically on that point of Amazon, I mean, I think in terms of Amazon delivering marketplaces, I think a lot of that is actually a sort of data mining. Not quite, but it to a certain degree. I mean, and then it's like, especially if you see the way it wants to like supply the Department of Defense also through these kind of marketplaces, but that end up being largely controlled by them. That's a like somewhat speculative, somewhat different point, but yeah. I mean, I'm hoping we don't quite ignore those, all those kinds of both the mechanics internally and the changes in it that have happened historically.
I guess I would just say very quickly, because I think we've got about 5 minutes left. But Hilary Wainwright, Pat Devine in particular, some really interesting essays that we did. This is just a primer on the economic calculation problem. We were trying to it's not a. It does not aim to be a robust response to the wonderful, extensive literature, both in computer science, economics, and a number of other fields that have engaged with the economic calculation problem. This is about bringing the conversation back in a popular fashion. If you want a really, really in-depth investigation of these things, there's a. We wanted to have a bibliography, but we never did. And maybe we should put that online so that people can. It also, again, because I mean, this is the longest book in the Verso Jacobin series, and they wanted to chop lots and lots and lots, and I think it's better for that. Absolutely, God bless editors. But we wanted to have things on the Pentagon. This enormous planning entity. We wanted to have a chapter on airlines and how airlines and airports plan the distribution of gates, which is not according to the market, because of course if it were according to the market, planes would fall out of the sky. And these are multidimensional comparisons, but we just didn't have the time to do that.
I wanted a chapter on ancient Babylon, and that was the first.
Oh God, the chapters on the 2 chapters on the Soviet Union were so much longer than they are, which is a good thing probably that they're so short now. Duncan's point, local co-ops, workers' control. I mean, the inspiration for the book was Frederick Jameson, the Marxist literary critics, sort of throwaway line about that there aren't any utopians anymore, whereas Walmart is properly utopian. And I mean, he's being a bit of a contrarian, a bit cheeky there, but he's actually, he has a point there. We should be aiming high. We should be, as Sam says, we should not be taking over the failing businesses and turning them to co-ops. I mean, like if they do that, absolutely, Sam's exactly how we should be defending them to the hilt. Let's aim high. Let's aim at what we used to call the commanding heights of the economy. Let's take over those. Let's not just rest in the margins. But I think there are 2 really important points raised by Pam and Sam that I'm not going to have a lot of time to go into this, but they are really, really crucial. And I'm going to slightly disagree with what Pam said. After all the lovely things that she said about us, when she said,
she's got a minute to take them back.
When she said, I think that distributing all the medicines to the people who need them is not that complicated. It is complicated, and I think that's actually the whole point of the economic calculation debate. It's incredibly complicated, and not merely about things that we desperately need, but things that we love, and we like the little things. We want not just bread but roses too. One of the great internal and correct internal critiques of Stalinism was how great it was. Its lack of consumer items. There were no pineapples or jeans or Elvis records. We need those too, and those are really complicated to predict and to plan for. One of the great, the arguments that the right often made when there was a pushback in terms of the economic calculation debate was, well, okay, fine. You can have your steel mills, you can have your nationalized coal mines. Those are easy. There's a handful of variables in the supply chain there. What do you do? But the consumer items, those are the really, really hard ones. That's one of the reasons that we wanted to talk about Walmart and Amazon, because we wanted to go after the hardest argument that they came against us. That actually, yes, we can even plan consumer items, but we're not saying that it's easy. It is hard, but we can do it. And then finally with Sam's point, and he goes into great length about this in this just absolutely outstanding essay for Catalyst, Socialism for Realists, which really does go to the point about it's not enough for us to talk about waiting for the glorious day and then we'll figure it out in the course of struggle, but that we do need to think about right now exactly what would it be, and then it could be that Bernie Sanders becomes president of the United States. That is not an infeasible thing. Now, he's largely a left social democrat than a socialist, but nevertheless, these people, if we ever come to power, in any sort of region, we will need something more off the shelf than what is available from the neoliberals or just left versions of that. We need to be properly utopian. We need to have some proper ideas of that. And when Sam says he's not wrong in any way when he says that there's a loss of revolutionary elan, years after, even a generation after the revolution, that we turn into administrators, and that there is a development of there's an element of control by the emergence of the class of planners, that they can potentially become a class for themselves, with their own set of interests independent from the rest of us. And how do we control that? Is it enough for us to just say, oh, we'll democratically control them? I think something's there. I think that is actually the solution. But we have to recognize this is another hard problem. The question that we cannot avoid the question of the state and what do we think about it. Socialism is supposed to be an anti-statist philosophy. If we think of the state as we define the state as a non-democratic authority ruling over us. If we think of the state as just the government or a set of administrators, and we want to get rid of that, I don't think that's ever going to happen. I think we can get rid of non-democratic authority. That's the state that I think we can get rid of. If we're talking about getting rid of administrators, I just don't see that ever happening. And so, okay, to wrap up, I think this is really important. I just wanted to get in the quote from Oscar Wilde, great socialist, democratic socialist, who said, socialism is all very well and good, but it takes up far too many evenings.
I only just wanted to make one point about the shortage of medicine in Greece, is that the shortage of medicine in Greece was not caused because there wasn't enough medicine, it was because people didn't have money to pay for it. That's my point.
Absolutely.
So perhaps the old is not yet dying, but the new will have to be born and perpetually reborn across generations. And have a good evening.
Results from my paper.